It took us a very long time, but I finished Psalm 15 last installment, uh, and I was trying to think. Well, what do I want to do next? Here's the one of the great things about Bible study is there is so much there. You literally will never get done with drawing the lessons out of Scripture. So it's not like I've done everything there is to do. Not even close. But still, when you've got 66 inspired books to choose from, what do you do next? Well, I settled on First Timothy. Now, I cannot say God told me that First Timothy would be next because that's not really. I think here's the deal on what God would have told me or could have told me. I think he would have said, "Hey, it's the whole Bible. Pick something." So I picked First Timothy. Now there's some interesting things about First Timothy that we got to set in place. And one of the interesting things I haven't talked very much about in a long time, and that is first century culture. What was the world like around 60 to 65 AD? Because that's, as far as we know, that's when Paul would have penned these words to Timothy. We know that in that era, I think sometimes we think of that era as very primitive. Well, in some ways it was technologically. In other ways, surprisingly not so. For instance, the Romans were in some ways technical geniuses between the Egyptians, the Greeks, and the Romans. Pretty amazing engineering technology had come about. Arches. We don't think much about arches, but arches, you think about this. Ancient arches, 3,000 years old, are still standing because the engineering and the construction were such that they would last for millennia. There was running water. Now, they didn't have flush toilets, but they did have, it wasn't just outhouses. There were amazing and elaborate baths with circulating water. I mean, it's a very, when you think about how, in so many ways, the tools they had to work with were primitive compared to the tools that we have at our disposal today. It was all manpower and woman power, but mainly manpower. Things were done manually. Well, okay. Let's think about the political situation. Well, politically, Rome was, kindly you would say, Rome was a semi-republic, but more realistically, what history leaves us with is that Rome was a dictatorship, and the Caesar was the dictator. His wishes were followed. Now, they may have been pushed back against by the Senate, but, and oh, by the way, the Senate was not comprised of elected officials. It was comprised of selected officials, and they were selected primarily because of their financial standing, their social standing. These were landed, meaning these were men who owned land, and they would have been the upper echelons of the socioeconomic strata. You didn't go to the polls and elect a Caesar. It didn't work that way. As a citizen, you had no say in who was or would not be the Caesar. You had to just accept who was, and either you rebelled against his decrees or you submitted to them, but you didn't have a say. Here's I think it's interesting and a very important aspect of Century 1 is that in the Roman Empire, a third of the citizens were slaves. Now, most historians will indicate that this is not the kind of slavery that we might think of as the pre-Civil War slavery in America. It was probably much more like the indentured servant who was in the servile position, right? And an indentured servant would have chosen to indenture themselves as a slave for a period of time, sometimes for their entire life, but they were taken care of by their owner. But it was still a matter of owner-owned. There were several different ways that were reasons why people were slaves. One is you were born into slavery. Your parents were slaves and you were born. That made you the possession of your parents' slave owner. Another was you sold yourself into slavery to pay debts or as a last resort for some kind of financial situation. A third reason would have been that you were part of a conquered people. And when Rome conquered a group of people, those who it didn't kill, it generally took as slaves. They were sold on the market or they were passed along to various rulers and military commanders and so forth. So a third of the world, though, 33% of the Roman population were slaves. This has a factor in the New Testament. I'm just going to say that about it to this point, and I think we're going to see some ways that holds implications. One of the other things is, and this is I think a significant thing, but we don't take it. We don't even think about it, and it has to do with the postal system. I want to complain about 37 or however many cents a stamp costs to get a letter from here clear across the country. But when I step back and realize that's very nearly nothing compared to what the actual cost of me getting my letter from here to there. In Paul's day, in Timothy's day, you didn't have a United Postal Service. You had emissaries and you had runners and carriers. Now, the Roman government, did have a system where they had specific individuals who would carry documents from Rome to various outposts of the Roman Empire and back. That was in place, and if you as a citizen could somehow get connected, you might be able to send your letters in that system, but not generally. So generally, if I'm Paul and I want to send a letter to Timothy, who we discover early on here in 1 Timothy is in Ephesus, I'm not across the globe, but I'm not across the street. And I have to figure out I have to hire someone or find someone who is going to Ephesus and entrust my letter to them. So it wouldn't have taken days. It could be weeks. It could even be months before a letter that was written, sealed, and sent arrives at its destination. Okay. News traveled slowly in Paul's day. But I don't even know who recorded or where it came from, but I remember in high school a friend of mine used to sing a song. Bad news travels like wildfire. Good news travels slow. They all call me wildfire everywhere I go. The truth is, some news travels like wildfire because it's gossip. And that's how news was passed along to the outposts and the outreaches of the Roman Empire. Travelers, merchants they traveled more than anyone because that's how they made their living, going from town to town. And they would usually, they might stop at villages, but their primary goal would have been cities. Bear in mind, there were some very large cities in Century 1. Nothing like when you think of LA or New York or even Atlanta or Dallas. But there were large cities of more than 100,000. And that's where the merchants would go. And so that's how news traveled. It was orally, okay? One last thing about letters. They were handwritten, obviously. Paul's letters were written in Greek. One important thing about Greek, I didn't realize, but my daughter when I say she's a Greek scholar, I don't mean that lightly. I'm not just saying, she's a brainiac. She is a brainiac, but she is truly a Greek scholar. And she has told me, in Greek, there are no punctuation marks. There are no capitalizations. In Greek, when Paul wrote, virtually all of his letters were dictated to, here's a word for you if you want to build your vocabulary, were dictated to an amanuensis, a secretary of sorts, all right? Who would pen them with quill and ink without punctuation. Why does that matter? Well, it matters because now when Greek from the New Testament in particular here is translated for us today, certain judgment calls have to be made for where does one sentence end and the next begin, what would have been the punctuation. And so again, my youngest daughter taught me all translation of ancient manuscripts is also interpretation. If you go word for word without punctuation, first of all, Greek syntax is not like English, and so the words are often far out of order. If you want to see what I'm talking about, go to your web browser and type in Interlinear Bible. And basically what that is a word for word literal translation of the Greek text. And as you read it, you'll realize that wow. You have to rearrange the words, and even with that, there are times when you have to choose which word best fits for our English translation what the Greek word is. It's okay. Now, last thing. I said that before, didn't I? Well, here is the last thing about Paul's letters. They were generally written either on parchment, which was lambskin that had been worked with and prepared, or papyrus, and probably more likely the parchment, because papyrus was quite some more fragile. It was a little bit like paper, but not quite. But okay, and it would have been rolled up and tied off and then sent. So what we have in our New Testament is truly a miracle, that these writings have been preserved for us, and we get to enjoy, I think would be an appropriate term. We get to enjoy the benefits of this miracle while we dive into Paul's first letter to Timothy. And I'll start with the text next time on Soul Care with Stevie Boy.